Welcome to ED 621 Module 12, Analyzing and Evaluating Student Performance Data. For this module, you're going to need to read and review all the material in Module 12. In particular, you're going to use Nolan and Taylor's book, Chapter 12, extensively for your information and assessment in this module. Our objectives for this module are that you make thoughtful, ethical, and reasonable decisions about classroom assessments and assessment practices. You will identify appropriate relationships between instruction and assessment. You'll practice interpreting assessment data in order to assess students' instructional needs and evaluate the success of instruction based on assessment data. And we've had some conversations about this in other classes. This is really about how you're going to look at student data and make effective decisions, instructional decisions. The guiding principles of classroom assessment are that you gather information about the student achievement and that it is accurate. You use that data to drive instruction, and you use that process and the results to promote maximum student learning. So it's not about the assessment, it's about the learning. Types of assessment that you're all familiar with: formative, summative. The new ones you're going to be introduced to in this chapter are norm reference and criterion referenced assessments. The first kind of assessment you're going to look at or become familiar with are content or curriculum-based assessments. These are the assessments that find out what students know, what students know and how they're progressing in your classroom in the content areas that you're instructing. These are ongoing. They are based directly on the instruction that you give and the kind of learning you are expecting from your students. These assessments provide you with the most accurate view of student growth within your own classroom context. Nobody else has these assessments but you. Unless you're using them directly out of the curriculum textbooks, then everybody who uses that curriculum will be using the same assessment. Generally, people will make adjustments to those based on what they're teaching and the content they're covering. They're low stakes in the sense that they're formative. These content-based assessments, which are again directly related to your instruction, are for the purpose of finding out how students are progressing and to help guide you in terms of how you're deciding to move forward with your instruction. The other two assessments are standardized assessments. Standardized means they're the same for everybody, that there's no changes, everybody gets the same thing. The norm reference tests are the national tests that you're familiar with, like the NAEP and the SAT. These provide information on how an individual compares with others on the same measure, and those are done with thousands of other students, and they're normed on the performance of these other students on the bell curve or the standard curve, and I will explain that to you shortly. The individual's standing is compared to that of the norm group. A percentile rank is obtained to show the relative standing in that group and discriminates between individuals based on rank. And I will show you that using the bell curve. Criterion reference tests are a step up from content-based tests. They are information on how an individual performed on a specific behavioral or academic objective, for example, reading. Your content-based reading assessment is really whatever chapter you've used, whatever chapter book you've used, whatever grammar material you've used, whatever it is, that's your content base. The criterion reference is a benchmark. The Alaska standards are the criterion for the AMP test that we use here in Alaska. That is a criterion reference test, but it is the same for everybody. It is a standardized test. So everybody in Alaska gets the same test. It ideally will measure against a presumed instruction and content coverage that everybody should have. So ideally, everybody has had this information by the time they take the test. Does that actually happen? No, not always. We'd like that to be different, but it's not always true. But it does allow you to interpret what an individual can do without considering the performance of others. So even though they're standardized, they're not normed. So you still get school-based profiles and classroom-based profiles from the criterion reference test based on the Alaska standards. The norm reference tests are generally based on the Common Core as well, as the Alaska standards are no different really, but Alaska standards are for Alaska and the norm reference tests are national. They're designed to measure results of instruction based on student performance and provides a description of performance based on a continuum of proficiency. So we'll be talking in a minute about using multiple measures to make instructional decisions, and this will be one of those measures that you can use in Access when you're making instructional decisions. So when you're looking at standardized tests and you're looking at normed reference tests, you need to understand how they're structured. And in your book, it describes in detail how all this happened. This is a summary of the statistics of how you look at the test data once you get it back. So this is how the information is relayed to you and how you have to be able to interpret this information. So you'll see, I'm going to go back and forth between two slides. You'll see a normal distribution curve or a bell-shaped curve. This has been developed back in the 60s, actually maybe even the 40s, to standardize information that comes in based on large samples of participants. So the normal distribution curve gives us a 23, 54, and 23% breakdown, a three-pronged breakdown. And it looks like this. So if you see this white area here, that is the 23%, and then altogether is 54% here, 54% in the middle, I'm sorry, and then another 23% on this side. So it's actually broken down into tetrials, but we never talk about those. So you can see, I will come back to how we use this. So the Stanines, which is a standardized score that very often some of the special education assessments use, and actually you can see it on some of the norm reference tests as well. They'll present data in three different fashions because school districts and states use data differently depending on how they're reporting it, and it's teachers too. So there are 9 Stanines in a bell curve, a scaled score with a mean of 5. So if you know your math, a mean means the middle. It's the average of all between 1 and 9. With a standard deviation of 2. That means that there are two points between each score. So if you look at Stanines, the standard deviation, this is the 2 right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You have your 9 Stanines, and each Stanine is related to a level of performance, below average, average, and above average. So if you have students performing at a 7, 8, or 9 level of a Stanine, you know they're doing pretty good. If they're 4, 5, or 6, they're doing average. They're marginally making it, and 1, 2, or 3, they're not doing so well. So the Stanines give you just a picture on a range of performance that's not very specific, but gives you an idea of where they fall. And that you could make a decision just looking at a Stanine score that a student on that particular content or in that normed material is doing, it was successful or not. The percentile rank is the one that you're going to be encountering the most. The students scoring at the 35th percentile scored as well or better than 35% of the students in the same grade in the norm group. It also means that 65% of the students exceeded that score. So this is not a percent. If you look below here, percent is a number out of 100. The ratio 1 to 100. I got 100% on my test. That means I got all 10 items right. I got 90% on my test. That means I got all 90 items right. I got 50% on my test. I mean I got 5 out of 10 right. So percent is just how many right you get. This is not what a percentile rank tells you. Because this is a norm test or a standardized test based on a large sample, you're looking at performance against a group of other students. So if we look at our normal distribution curve, you will see that the percentile, as you go up in percentile, there are more people that do poorer than you. If you go down in percentile, there are more people that do better than you. So and this is also pretty much ranked with these 3 sections in the normal distribution curve. You have the 39th percentile, 50th, and 76th percentile. What's considered outliers are the very high and the very low, the 4 percenters. These students function extremely low. These students function extremely high relative to the large body of students that the test was normed and standardized on, or in normed or grouped on in your school district. So the sample of students is, for a criterion-based test, is the school district or the school or your class. the sample for a norm reference test is a national sample, so it gets really big. So when you see a percentile, if I get a 76th percentile in math, that means that I did better than 76% of the students who took the test. I didn't get 76 right. It's how many of the sample of students did better or worse than the rest. So if you get 50th percentile, that means you have as many did better as many did poorer than you on that particular item or in that particular content. So percentile is something that do your research, make sure that you're very familiar with how percentile works. The normal curve equivalent goes by tens. It's not much different than a standard. It's just ranged, it's just numbered differently, and it gives you more specific information. You can see that you have points of difference between each level of normal curve equivalent. Proficiency range, you just saw that one, and I can basically below average, average, and above average. Standard error of measurement is a confidence band, and grade equivalent is based on a norm sample. Grade equivalent, you also will be using grade equivalent. It's not on this particular model, but grade equivalent of the material is again based on a very, very large sample that says average 5th graders should be able to do this by this time. Average 6th graders should be able to do this by this time. Students, for example, in Alaska, some get that instruction, some don't get that instruction for a variety of reasons, and so they'll fall low. It doesn't mean that they're not smart. It means they haven't had the instruction, or they haven't had access to that material. So the idea of understanding this is also not to just make decisions on instruction from your end of it, but to recognize the context that the students are in and why they might have scored the way they have. No, these statistics, these tests give you a snapshot of student performance. This is not the end result. It is not something that's fixed in their ability or skill or intelligence. It just gives you a picture of where they fall on a standardized test or a norm reference test. Many of you will be using Ames Web, and this is just to familiarize you with what it looks like. They use box and whisker charts. Basically, the box and whisker charts are vertical bell curves. So you have your, instead of sideways like we just saw in the bell curve, you have your median here, you've got your curve, you've got your 90% here, 90th percentile here, 10th percentile here, below average, average, above average. So you can see they're just sideways bell curves. And then you can see where a student falls on a measure. So this particular measure is from kindergarten. This is for ELLs, and this is on their letter and sound fluency, which seems very discrete information. But even for kindergartners, learning these things is part of learning language, and so they assess this. And you can see that on the letter name fluency here, the student falls above average. Here's the expected, and they do very well with that. You can see that the letter sound fluency, they're almost close to average. The phonemic sound fluency, they're high, but interestingly, the bell curve is high, so really they're just almost average, even though this is the target. The target and the median are two different things. This is the target, and this is the median. This is your 50th percentile. This is the target where they want a student to at least meet that, right? So this student's doing very well in terms of their ability, their skills in, and then the last one is nonsense word fluency. Their skills in these particular discrete skill fluencies. So this is, this can be an individual student, or this can be, the dot is the individual student, and then the green is the range of where the students fell in the school. This is probably more than you need to know right now, but you can see that basically you're looking at a normal curve or bell curve sideways, so that you can make decisions based on what you want to do instructionally in these areas for students. The whole idea is to use the data instructionally. Many people are concerned about the validity of the assessments, and there are a lot of ways to look at validity. Basically, validity means, does it measure what you say it's going to measure? The content validity means the face validity. Does it measure, like if you're assessing how to write a 5-paragraph essay, does it measure how to write a 5-paragraph essay? Or an expert's opinion, which I have no opinion on that. Criterion is predictive. So the Criterion reference tests predict, or intended to predict, how a student falls, how a student will do moving forward. That will they be successful moving forward from here. Concurrent validity means, does it match what's happening right now? And construct validity, does the actual item measure, and it's different than face validity, does the actual item measure what it says it's going to measure? So the whole idea of validity is essentially that it measures what you want it to measure. Reliability means that it will do the same thing each time, that you will get the same kind of response each time from the same student that had the same instruction and has the same skills. That's why they make test retests, because for one thing, there's test wiseness, which you will probably cover in maybe another class. But test wiseness basically is that a student will take a test and then they'll figure out how it works. And if you give them the same test, they'll get more right answers because they know how it works. So you have to give them, the format's the same, but the items are different, so they don't memorize the test essentially. So test retest or parallel forms is how they avoid students memorizing the test. And consistency means that the items are congruent with what's being asked of the students, and they have iterator reliability, which is what you use when you create rubrics. The iterator reliability is that whole piece of I'm going to measure it, you're going to measure it, and how close are we in getting the same response? And if we're not close, that means either the measure, the rubric isn't very good, or you and I don't have a very good criterion of how we're looking at student work. So those are just things you need to remember when you're giving assessments. And that an assessment comes in two different forms. It comes in the form where you have given instruction and then you're assessing the instruction, and where a student is asked to do something whether or not they've had the instruction, which gives you some kind of predictive ability about where they can go, what they know in the larger picture of the content area. It's, assessments is a big industry, and it's complicated, and they've spent, decades, almost a century, probably more than a century, developing very clear criteria for statistical analysis of assessments. So that's, you're developing assessments and you're just looking at how to make the criteria clear. Context in assessment. Before achievement test scores can be useful to educators, they need to be evaluated within a context. So when you take all that data from all those assessments, you use it to plan instruction, it's used to support school or district administrators as they focus on allocating resources. For example, the ASPE scores that the state has, Alaska State has for the school districts, will determine what schools get most support. If a school's falling very low, then they are going to get more financial and other resource supports than schools that are functioning very high. And they're used, the assessment achievement data is used to empower school staff as you work to improve educational outcomes. This is really where you're at right now. It's like, how can I use this information to improve the outcomes for my students? So the ultimate user of the assessment information is the student, and you want to set your goals accordingly. You want to use multiple measures because all measures have some error, and that was the standard error of measurement, which I didn't talk about in either of the box and whisker charts or the bell curve. Every assessment has a standard error of measurement. Every item has a standard error of measurement, and basically that means that there's a range at which it's correct, and that a student can fall in that range. But the larger the standard error of measurement, the less accurate, the less valid an item is. And so all test makers try and make a very narrow standard error of measurement range for their test items. The more accurate and the more concise and the more focused the items, the smaller the standard error of measurement. All the same, you need to use multiple sources in order to make effective decisions. Writing samples, content unit tests, Ames web scores, criterion-based assessment. Use all of these things, make a little map, make a little chart, make a little Excel spreadsheet, put the student scores in there, and take a look at patterns. So the reason you're doing this is because you're looking at patterns. using the map, using the AMP scores. So, guiding questions when you're evaluating assessment data. What are my students' strengths with regard to the required knowledge and skills? This is what you're doing. Now you're going to be taking a norm reference test and a criterion reference test as your assignment and making some decisions based on it using these questions. What are my students' learning needs with regard to the required knowledge and skills? Do students have sufficient foundational content and process skills to approach new learning? You're not going to have all this information for the assignment, of course. How can I support student learning through scaffolding and differentiation? You always need, and in the second part of Chapter 12 in Nolan and Taylor is a whole section on accommodations for ELLs and special ed, and you need to pay particularly close attention to that when you do your assignment, because your assignment is about an EL student, a student who speaks another language than English. And Nolan and Taylor give a very nice description of some of the things that need to happen and need to be considered when you're analyzing assessment data for ELs. So that's my tip to you. Pay very close attention to that. Here's some information for you. The Alaska School Performance Index. You can actually, if you're in a district, you can look it up and see where they're at now. We had that snafu last year with the AMP. So, I will say, yeah. So we're going to have the new AMP this year, as far as I know. Your tasks for Module 12. Read, review, and apply the material in Module 12, please. All assignments are due per dates on the course schedule. Complete and post your steps 1 through 4 of analysis of student work template along with student assessment documents to the discussion forum prior to week 4 class. For the critical friend discussion and review, we're having a peer review and discussion of the analysis of student work with your student data, so you should have all that ready to go. Please identify last name and content area when you post it in the discussion forum. You'll attend class 4 meeting where we'll have this discussion, and then you'll draft step 5 of the analysis of student work and submit that for your final assignment for analysis of student work. For the rest of Module 12, you're going to complete and submit the reading and using standardized test data assessment to assign to the assignment Dropbox by the assigned due date. That is where you're going to have to really use the information from the Taylor and Nolan and Taylor book. Complete and submit your analysis of student work template to the Dropbox by the assigned due date. Complete 3-to-1 reflection to the discussion forum by the assigned due date. That's on the analysis of student work. So you've got a few elements. Everything's in the folder, in the content, in the module, where you can see the submission Dropboxes. For your final course product, the UBD unit that you've created, you're going to take the traditional test items and the CPTs, the grasps, and you're going to put them into the unit. You're going to mark them in red so I can see that you've done it, because I will look at the traditional test items you've done and the performance tasks that you've created, and I will look to see that they're in the unit. So the only thing you have to do to your unit is to embed the grasps and embed the traditional test items into their respective lessons. Where do they go? How do they fit? And the CPTs also just go in their boxes up top, the performance test boxes. And then refer to them, and they should be scaffolded into your lessons. Your assessment portfolio is strictly just that. It's a portfolio of products. And the products are your 2 grasp culminating performance tasks, the rubrics for each of the grasps, your test bank traditional test items, a copy of your completed analysis of student work, and a copy of your reading and using standardized test data assignment. It needs a cover page. It needs to look professional and something you would be proud to present to complete end of course reflection in the Dropbox in Module 12. I actually think it's in, yes, I think it is in the Dropbox. If it's not, it's in the discussion forum. And then, of course, open Module 12 for the submission criteria, Dropboxes, and rubrics. So if you have any questions, you know that you can let me know. I think that I'm hoping that you'll take some time with the Nolan Taylor book, because that's what really will make you successful with the reading and using standardized test data assignment, because that's really what it's coming from, that whole chapter. So with that, Happy evaluating and analyzing test data, and thank you for your hard work in this course.